Censorship is the strongest drive in human nature. Sex is a weak second.
Do you ever find yourself censoring yourself? Not saying what you feel or believe in case it's disapproved of, or in case you get it wrong? Are the questions you're nervous about posing ideas you're nervous about questioning? This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates, and my answer to those questions is yes, yes, and yes. In this episode, we are examining the counterculture of ideas. Not just ideas about music, drugs, gender, politics, fashion, food, spirituality, hairstyles, the environment that emerged in the 50s, 60s and 70s, but ideas that have run counter to the culture throughout history. Ideas and words and images that have been considered by those in power in the culture to be subversive, taboo, forbidden, dangerous. And my guest today, ERIC BERKOWITZ, a human rights lawyer and journalist, has just published a terrific book, Dangerous Ideas, a brief history of censorship in the West from the ancients to fake news. It's the latest in his works on history and the law. And in case you're thinking, history, law, sounds a little dull, fear not, for this book, this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture is filled with stories, human stories, sometimes comical, sometimes moving, often alarming. And for me, this book really helped to bring some clarity into this fog, some solid ground into the marsh that we seem to be wandering around in. I seem to be wandering around in anyway. Ideas about wokeness, cancel culture, deplatforming, defunding, reactionary invective, whether it be from the left or the right. And also, it's a terrific read. So, I'm very pleased to welcome the author, ERIC BERKOWITZ. Hello, ERIC.
Thanks for having me.
You're an author, you're a human rights lawyer, you're a journalist, right? You've got a legal practice which is devoted to poor and refugees, particularly asylum seekers.
Yeah.
I did read that you've never lost an asylum case. So my very first question to you really is, how do you fit it all in? What's the secret?
If you talk to my wife, she would say he doesn't fit it in. It's, I made a decision about 20 years ago. I had a legal practice devoted, I was basically a hatchet man for large companies. And that was remunerative, certainly, but you would go home at the end of a day and say, okay, what exactly have I done today?
Right.
So sometime when I was able to do it, I decided that my real calling was, to write, and I've always been consumed with history. And then so much of my writing has been really a portion, or let's say inspired by or informed by my legal practice.
Right.
And when I returned I lived in Europe for several years, and when I returned, I decided to retool my legal practice toward the representation of people who actually needed it. And so right now, after 4 years of what we call in America the former guy, um, the asylum needs are that much more crucial and urgent. And so yes, at times there's not a lot of sleep, but every once in a while you look at what you've done and you think, oh, yeah, that wasn't so bad.
Well, look, let's just talk about your. I mean, we're circling round and we're gonna come to the Dangerous Ideas book, but
Yeah.
Your previous book, Sex and Punishment, not a book as I first thought about S&M, but actually about 4,000 years of judging desire, and I can see the parallel with this book. Dangerous Ideas, this history, an extraordinary history of censorship. But I thought we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the themes which come out of that. But let's just start off with a definition. I mean, what for you is a dangerous idea?
Well, if you're asking ERIC BERKOWITZ, I don't think there is a dangerous idea. I think ideas can be hideous, ideas can be hurtful, ideas can be inflammatory, But in this case, I stand really closely with the sort of absolutist vision of censorship, where ideas, even if they're hideous, need to be aired, if only to be refuted. You know, but the the phrase dangerous ideas was really me sort of adopting in the most general sense what censors and people in society have felt. And so, what is a dangerous idea when you don't ask me? A dangerous idea is one that rattles and challenges one's preconception of how the world is.
Hmm.
Okay?
Right.
So that could be on a political level, uh, that could be on a social level, that could be on a personal level. I mean, censorship, there's a very funny quote. I just found it. Uh, and it sort of he sort of summarizes much of my book writing career. This is by a former editor of the Los Angeles Times, Phil Kirby, who who said censorship is the strongest drive in human nature. Sex is a weak second. So I wrote two books about the intersection of sex and law, from the beginning to the present. That was sort of a 5 or 6 year project because I really identified that sex was one of the sort of driving forces in social and political life. Well, picking up on Phil Kirby here, I think censorship, the urge to tell someone to shut up, the urge to try and silence someone because what they're saying hurts or challenges. Okay, everything from the president of China censoring an image of Winnie the Pooh because everyone in China said that he looked like Winnie the Pooh, to blasphemy, everything, something that challenges, something that makes one uncomfortable. That sort of goes to who we are and how we want our society to be arranged.
Right.
And
So I
it goes a
mean,
step further.
so for you, so let's, and in terms of defining what censorship means, so censorship for you is a response to an idea which is considered usually by the powerful as dangerous, right?
Yes, censorship has, I mean, the whole dynamics of censorship have changed massively over the years, and we are living in a period where there's even a new phase. Generally, the dynamics of censorship have been those with authority, those with guns or police or the power to damn one to hell for life, someone with authority over another, exerting that authority to either to silence or punish either a person or try almost entirely vainly to suppress that idea. So, and the targets have generally been society's outliers, heretics, artists,
Mm.
blasphemers, nosy reporters, people who were vulnerable. Uh, we now have a third player in censorship, are people who don't have guns but have actually more power than any dictator could have ever hoped for, which are the internet companies.
Yeah, right. Well, this book that you've written, I mean, it is an extraordinary survey of the subject, and it's filled with fascinating, terrifying anecdotes and stories, and for me, very surprising stuff. I'll talk a little bit later about why it shook me a bit, because I've just finished a book myself, and I'm thinking now I've got to insert at least one additional paragraph, having read Eric's book. But I mean, where did it all begin? I mean, let's start with that. We're going to end with where it is at the moment. Where did it all begin in terms of your research? How old is it, censorship?
I think censorship emerged. I mean, again, no one left a memo in this regard, but I think that censorship, from what I can glean through, pretty aggressive research, is that censorship is really concomitant with language itself.
Right.
Because words and images have power. Words and images can wield power. I mean, many of the creation stories of societies, even the Christian, put the word at the beginning. In the beginning was the word. In fact, to the Peruvians, to the Huitoto people of Peru, the word was before creation. So words are volatile, and words and images have always been felt to be not only just signifiers of something else, but actually in and of themselves having influence. And so I think the real impulse of censorship, if we go back to the beginning, uh, is humankind's urge to control language to prevent the calamities that the misuse of language and images could bring. Therefore, the first two commandments: no blasphemy, no words against God, and no graven images, because those are evil. Censorship is hard baked into our um, outlook on life, because words are not simply like instructions to how to operate your blender. They carry their own power.
And in fact, of course, there is a big part of the book as well, which is about images. So, I mean, it is this thing about words and images. There's another thing which I wanted to talk to you about as well, in terms of culture, which is also the kind of censorship of passion, which I think maybe your earlier book was about. I mean, certainly in the Soviet Union, for instance, the area that I've kind of looked into. One big thing which seemed to excite the censors was dancing. The foxtrot, that kind of most innocent of moves, seemed to arouse a huge amount of ire amongst the Soviet ideologues like Maxim Gorky, etc. And that was a theme throughout as well, was it? The censorship of the kind of, in a way, the censorship of human passions, or the attempts to control passions in a way, or to marshal them in the service of ideology.
I would want your input on this, but I would surmise, and I've heard that myself, that for something about of all the dances, the foxtrot created such consternation amongst the Soviets, is because I think not only because it showed a certain limitlessness of human expression, and by virtue of that, by virtue of people dancing together, holding each other, it's very sensual dance, indicates that the state is somehow left out of the equation when the state is trying to control every aspect of human life. So if your question is, what is it about human passion itself that excites censorship, is because I think power itself is extremely fragile. Okay, and as even when power is nearly absolute, and there is no reason for power to feel a certain challenge, when people are operating in a certain way that means that they're not, existing under the rubric of that power, somehow it becomes a challenge. I mean, the most extreme example of that has to be Mao Zedong in China during the Cultural Revolution, when any aspect of human interest or of human preoccupation outside that of the worship of the state was censored. That would include pigtails. That would include family photographs. The Red Guards would barge into houses and take family photographs off shelves and throw them away, because that showed an interest in something other than Mao himself or the state. And so the fragility of power is itself a very, very central theme of my book, because I was just simply astounded at just how touchy power is, and just how little it has taken to create, persecutions, prosecutions, suppressions. And I think in the current environment that we're in, where we're always trying to, cancel other expressions that challenge us or that are offensive to us, we're really have taken the mantle of the touchiest leaders of, days gone by.
Yeah, you do talk about this. Why are we so touchy now? But that touchiness, I mean, there is also, you mentioned, I love your thing about, let's bring it close to home in the UK. Henry VIII decreed death for anybody who imagined his demise, right? I didn't quite...
it's one of your most brilliant inventions, is the treason law from the 14th century.
Come on, just tell us more about that. It's just such a great story.
in the late Middle Ages in England, there was, of course, there's always been treason in one form or another. So the Brits, had the, we have common law, so it wasn't quite written down, and around the 14th century, there was a 1351, I think it was, there was a statute written, the treason statute, which had this expression to compass or imagine the death of the king. This is probably one of the original thought crimes. Okay,
Right.
Henry VIII
Right.
picked up on it, and he was a paranoid, and he was brutal, and so he pushed through interpretations and more statutes that if you so much as again imagined not only the death of the king, but situations that were challenging to him, such as if you argued for the legitimacy of one of his past marriages, that became treasonous. Everyone became so confused around him that his doctors when he got sick, were afraid to pronounce him, to say, Your Majesty, you're ill, because
Yeah.
that might bring them to the executioner. So the idea of a thought crime, the idea of a dangerous idea, the idea of thinking something that is a challenge to the state runs through, again, of course, Henry VIII was an extreme example. But England dusted off that statute and used it repeatedly, particularly in the late 18th century. And my former president, Donald Trump, you know, was absolutely ready to condemn and jail anyone who imagined or thought or expressed thoughts against him,
Mm.
regardless of whether it posed any kind of a tangible challenge.
Well, I mean, he was a kind of, or is, I suppose, a kind of Henry VIII type figure in a way, isn't he? I mean, so that's not surprising so much there. But this is the other thing about the book, is that the same themes repeat time and
Astounding,
time
yeah.
again down the millennia. I mean, that description of Henry VIII's, super touchiness, that anyone even imagines his demise. But I mean, that issue with his doctors, I mean, that was repeated with Stalin. Stalin, probably may have survived that final stroke, but his doctors were too terrified to actually do anything about it. Because they didn't want to go in there and treat him in case they were then accused of killing him. So it's sort of he's killed by his own touchiness, and that whole thing about touchiness, which you bring in, is another theme which runs through it from the beginning. And I think the other thing which you talk about is that it's all in vain somehow, isn't it? I mean, let's just tell us about that, because one of your theses is that censorship does not work, and that's one of the reasons I think that you come down as an absolutist against it, right?
Well, I mean, there was a kind of a minor thinker in the 19th century, a guy named Leslie Stephan, who was actually Virginia Woolf's father, I believe. Wrote an interesting essay that I brought up in the book, which is, for censorship ever to work, you actually have to go inside the minds of those that you're trying to censor. I mean, censoring an expression, censoring a book, censoring a painting, destroying a church, smashing a statue, dictating the way something might be taught. Those are all, in effect, expressions of weakness, expressions of desperation, because when you destroy, a piece of expression, you're not destroying the idea. Okay, it never works. In fact, it really creates the opposite effect. I mean, there's this cliche in the United States called "banned in Boston," which means that there was a period where everything was censored in Boston. The neo-puritanical elite, made things difficult. And what's behind that expression is "I want it." If something is banned, you want it. It creates what we call the Streisand effect. That Barbra Streisand once objected to an aerial picture of her villa on the beach, and by her making noise about it, everybody knew about it. And so it as soon as the Catholic Church came out with its list of forbidden books, which included before long included Galileo, Catholic monks themselves drove up the price of his book, Dialogue on Two Worlds, because they went to get it. I mean, as soon as the printing press was invented, that's when the ocean of censorship laws began to pour forth from states and church. So publishers told their writers to write anything that would be forbidden. Why? Because it makes a lot more money. And somehow things that are forbidden, there's a business reason, and then there's the psychological reason. Oh, they must be doing something right. The main French censor from the 19th century, Malcher, himself said that anyone who reads only approved books are behind the times by at least a century. And what they did was they eventually stopped burning books in public, because by doing so, they'd only managed to spike sales. I mean, almost continually with every anecdote that I tell, I will talk about one book or another that was, persecuted or destroyed in the 17th century. And as I'm sitting here in my little dungeon writing my book, I go on the internet, as everyone can, and I look for that book, and kapow, it shows up.
Right.
It's very, very rare that a book is destroyed entirely, and it's almost never that an idea is destroyed.
Yeah, I mean,
you have a very, very, very similar situation now with hate speech, where there's this massive effort, particularly in Europe and less so here, but growing, to suppress expressions that are hateful or offensive, I guess on the idea that by doing so, we're going to quell hatred. It does not work.
Yes. So, I mean, you've said this: once transmitted, an idea is not easily extinguished, and then also, once it's out there, and then this, she's called the Streisand effect. It's a great phrase.
Yeah.
Information becomes more popular by trying to ban it, and that's a sort of ancient phenomenon, isn't it? So that goes all the way back. Again, in my kind of area, which is, the forbidden music in the Soviet Union, you just saw that played out time and time again. I mean, for instance, the Soviet authorities, the kind of musical authorities, started in the 20s to publish a list of songs, specific songs that it was forbidden to perform. And it started off as a kind of, 2 or 3 sheets, and by the end, it was like a kind of old-fashioned telephone directory in thickness. It got bigger and bigger and bigger each year.
So that became a recommended list of songs to obtain.
Of course, it became the playbook, in a way. Now, but and of course, and then people, Russians, extremely inventive or agile, as they would say, were continually coming up with ways to circumvent the censor. And of course, maybe songs that wouldn't have been that popular became much more popular because they were forbidden, the forbidden fruit thing. But also, I think that whatever the authorities were attempting to do, they kind of, in a way, made it more likely somehow. Because in doing so, in, say, forbidding popular culture in this case, these weren't particularly dangerous ideas, they were popular songs. But by doing so, they kind of delegitimized themselves, particularly, of course, because they were completely hypocritical, and at their private functions would have people performing those songs,
Really?
Of course, yeah.
Like, are we talking about songs like American Blues, or are we talking about the Beatles, or are we talking about I'm specifically talking in a way about with these records, with the X-ray records. So the headline story, of course, is about jazz and rock and roll, Western stuff. So we've got this idea that we had the great stuff, the Soviet kids couldn't get it and they wanted it, and that's true, okay, but actually the real story of those records, what I call Soviet soul music, is the forbidden Russian songs. A culture its own culture had become forbidden. Songs made by emigres who'd fled after the revolution, but also songs that were written within the Soviet Union about real life there, songs which were written about the Gulag life, songs which were written about criminality and actually ordinary stuff quite often. Songs that actually spoke to what people were experiencing.
There were songs about people's real life, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And songs about suffering, songs about love, lust, fighting, passion, criminality, songs about the ridiculousness of the Soviet system. And of course, Isabella Yureva, who was a Soviet singer and extremely popular, Her own repertoire, which was about 300 songs, got reduced to about 5, I think, because she sang in a style called Russian Gypsy Tango, which is regarded as being too passionate. It aroused the wrong kind of
Yeah.
emotions in young people. But she told a story about how the phone rang in the middle of the night and a voice on the end said, "Comrade Yureva, there's a car waiting for you. You must get into it." And of course, in the Soviet Union at that time, that was pretty much felt like a death sentence. She was
Yeah.
terrified, obviously. Thought she was going to get taken off to
A
Lubyanka.
bad place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but in fact, actually what happened is that she was taken to a party where there was Stalin and various other people in the Kremlin. There was another singer there.
Astounding.
And she was with the head of one of the heads of the Communist Party before they went in, and he leant over to her and said, "Comrade Yureva, don't bother with the Soviet songs. Sing the gypsy romances." So you can imagine the situation that put her in, because was it a trick? Was she being tested? But of course, she went ahead and sang them, and of course, that's what they wanted to hear. They loved that, and I think so. This ties into what
It's
you
an
talk.
incredible story that you just told.
Yeah, it is an incredible story, and it's also sort of symptomatic somehow of another big theme in your book, which you might say is about class and censorship. Because there wasn't a class system as we know it in the Soviet Union, but there kind of was between the political class and the proletariat. So, just as in Orwell, the inner party and the outer party. So, just talk to that, Eric, about that relationship between censorship and the class systems of the world.
Yes, that was not something I expected, but that was sort of an observation that emerged as I, plowed through all this material. That given the fact that censorship often, or more often than not, doesn't work, meaning that either the pieces of expression or the expressions themselves don't die, there's been sort of an implicit admittance of that. And so much censorship over the years has really been a question of channeling speech as much as it has been suppressing it. Meaning
Right.
that pieces of speech, books, pictures, etc. Now we're going to get into dirty pictures and everything else. Are are sequestered by class, meaning that those with power generally will feel that what's out there is suitable for them, but not for others. And that also goes with just straight suppressions of the press, in trying to report on the ruling classes themselves. All this really started, I can go on. I mean, it started really with the first Chinese emperor.
Well,
Um,
tell us about him.
yeah, he's one of my favorite characters. I grew to really have a real sort of perverse affection for this guy. Xi Jin, Shi Huang, which I'm sure I'm butchering his name, unified China in the 3rd century BC. Warrior, unified the 7 kingdoms, weights and measures, began to build the wall. A powerful leader, but hated horribly, and was being criticized, massively by Confucian scholars and other scholars who, said this is the Dark Age. There were better ages before. So what he was paranoid and was consumed with history that he was being compared with the history that preceded him. So what he did was he had his people gather up all the books of literature and poetry, philosophy, particularly Confucian philosophy that existed, kept it for himself, and then destroyed the rest of it, and for good measure destroyed 400 Confucian scholars. Meaning that literature that he found dangerous, it was okay for him and the people he allowed it to see, but not for anyone else. And the idea of you know uh, uh, taking it to the semi-modern period, very often you were talking about the proletariat. This became a very strong thing, particularly in England after the French Revolution in the very troubled years of the early 19th century, where there was, and throughout the 19th century, with all the revolution that was happening in Europe, a real major effort to keep literature and ideas that were thought to agitate the poorer classes, to keep it away from them. This just astounds me. There was a book called The Fruits of Philosophy, which had nothing to do with fruit and nothing to do with philosophy. What it had to do with was having sex without creating pregnancy. It was sort of an early birth control manual, what they called a marriage manual. They were common in the 19th century, and it had been circulating for decades and decades in pricey editions and kind of for the use of upper middle class couples. Well, in 1877, this George Bredlaw and Annie Besant brought it out in a cheap edition and were instantly prosecuted for obscenity. And the prosecutor called it lewd and filthy and depraved public morals. This is exactly the same book, okay? And Annie Besant said in trial, it's a horrible thing to put us in danger of prison for giving information to the poor, which may with impunity be given to the rich. And they lost, okay? But it was overturned on a technicality, but still this woman, Annie Besant, lost her custody of her child because she was found to be an unfit mother. They weren't trying to suppress the book. They were trying to suppress the book for a certain class of people.
Throughout your book, or particularly in the sort of latter half of it, the UK comes out of it pretty badly. That was a bit of an eye opener for me.
Well, the book was commissioned by the UK publisher, so I stressed a lot of the UK material.
Yeah, it's quite funny, a lot of it, in retrospect, not funny at the time. And in fact, of course, one of the things which for me was a bit of an eye-opener, having just finished, as I said, my book on the forbidden music in the Soviet Union, of course, is that a lot of the stuff that was going on there, which in a kind of Cold War propaganda way, it's easy for all of us, me too, to assume that it's all going on that side of the Iron Curtain. Well, when I read your book, I realised that virtually everything that was going on there was going on here too, but in a much milder version, much more polite version. Obviously, when you've got a totalitarian state with the whole power of the state behind the security forces, you can brutalise people, you can ruin them, you can cart them away and imprison them, and you can shoot them. But that didn't go on here so much. But this is Lenin talking here. Every artist, everybody who considers himself an artist, has the right to create freely according to his ideal, independent of everything. However, we are communists and we must not stand with folded hands and let chaos develop as it pleases. We must systematically guide this process and form its result. Well, there, in essence, was the story of what was to happen, of course, because that systematic guiding turned into, gulags and shooting people. And of course, we kind of know that and, already sort of thing. But I was quite surprised to read in your book, this is in 1938, a note to the police from a Home Office official who stressed the importance of not giving the impression that it was in any way acting as censors or have any power to ban a book. But, this is William Johnson Hicks, known as Jix, promising strong enforcement against indecency, including Shakespeare's coarser passages, when published cheaply. To just pick up on your previous thing about the class thing, and stated that these actions wouldn't fetter anybody's right to write what the spirit moves them to write. He claimed he was merely fulfilling his duty to carry out the law, taking pains to affirm, I am not a literary censor. And it's exactly the same thing, isn't it, going on there? As you say, the double speakers, as Orwell would have called it, claiming that it wasn't censorship, but of course it was, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just really made a number of my points, quite succinctly. That very often even the subject of censorship itself is censored. I mean,
Right.
it's very, very rare. Lenin was rather forthcoming, but as I understand it, free speech was guaranteed in the Soviet Constitution. And free
Right.
speech is guaranteed in the European Convention on Human Rights, but there's always a second paragraph, and it's always unless, and
Right.
and at least in the European Convention of Human Rights and in Article 19, there's always ringing endorsements of free speech unless. it's a challenge to democracy, or that it's a challenge to a good order society. Other than in the United States, which is taken a rather absolutist view, although that's changing. There's always the reservation of right. Censorship in that definition is pre-approval. So you can write what you want, you can express what you want. You might have to take your lumps afterwards. You might be jailed, or your book might be suppressed. But that's not censorship. That's simply enforcing the law for a good order of society, obscenity, et cetera, et cetera. But that, to me, that kind of fine distinction in the end doesn't really mean much for two reasons. One, a book can still be censored, and two, the idea that what you're writing will come under fire from either the government, from the church, or from your peers, as is happening now in greater extent. It creates a self-censorship, creates
Right.
an inner repression of thought. I mean, why would you produce something that is going to, in the end,
Right.
cause this kind of trouble? I had that experience. I had some experiences in this book trying to, and I'm sure you do with your writing. We try and resist it, but you think, who's going to be offended? How
Yep.
will this get me in trouble? Will this make my mother ashamed of me? On and on and on. But I mean, so Jix was being very blithe about the whole thing, and from what I see, deceptive.
So even in the US, right, which is the home of free speech, but you talk about this thing called the Sedition Act. I never heard of it, but it's where it's a crime to willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of the government of the United States. That's an act, isn't it? Right. This is this.
Yeah, that was
This
from
is
World War One. Yeah.
right.
The key word there is abusive, because this gets to what we were talking about with touchiness. Okay, that America's going into World War One. There wasn't a particularly huge groundswell of support for us getting into that war 3 years into it, and so in order to sort of quell dissent, of which there was much, so I forgot how many millions of Americans at that point were native German speakers.
Right.
Um, the government took extreme measures, not only against speech that might interfere with the draft or with conscription or might actually cause a riot, but with anything that is abusive to not only the war effort, but our former government. America has done that quite a bit. I mean,
Right.
7 or 8 years after we adopted the First Amendment, this is at the end of the 18th century, we adopted a very similar act, the Sedition Act, which made pretty much all dissent a crime. And so America of the last 4 or 5 decades, I think, is probably unique in history, because we've come so far so fast. In my book, I document thousands of people during and after World War One, often immigrants, German speakers, Jews, socialists, who were simply prosecuted and put in jail without without a lot of fuss, because they, merely by their existence or what they said, posed some kind of ideological challenge to the United
Right.
States. Well, we've come quite far from that. In the 60s, the Supreme Court adopted the current absolutist view, which basically said that this is a good thing. It's good to criticize the government. This is healthy. And you know what else? It's good to offend one another, because that kind of, what's the word they used? Verbal cacophony, is that spirited, let's call it, dialogue, is good for society, for clearing out ideas, for airing them and letting the better ones rise to the top. Well, that is, that environment that I grew up in, I think, is quite unique in human history, and I'm not sure how much longer it's going to last.
Well, that's a great part as well of what you talk about, which is, a subject close to the heart of this program, which is the effect of counterculture and censorship, right? So those countercultural ideas, it really made that Thomas Paine thing about it's important to express all ideas and dissent for the good of everybody in a kind of psychotherapeutic way, you could even say, culturally speaking, is to get it out there. And of course, that's a big theme for you too, isn't it? Is that apart from the fact that censorship doesn't work, etc., it's better to have it out there. I want to come back to that whole thing about the relationship between censorship and free speech, but just to pick up on what you were talking about earlier in terms of the Sedition Act, you also have said that crackdowns, censorship in this case, almost inevitably happen when societies confront overwhelming crisis. Now, the First World War is kind of in a way where that thing got going, the Sedition Act, and of course wartime has been a time, particularly in the 20th century, hasn't it, where all sorts of societies have exercised censorship for, inverted commas, the common good, right? I mean, this is you, again, quoting you, talking about Prime Minister of ours, Lloyd George. If people really knew the war will be stopped tomorrow, but of course they don't know and can't know. The correspondents don't write, and the censorship would not pass the truth. What they do send is not the war, but just a pretty picture of the war, with everybody doing gallant deeds. And you also talk, I'd never heard of this, absolutely fascinating stuff. You talk about these, the field service postcard known as the whiz bang or the quick fizzer. Is it quick fizzer or quick fixer? Which this is a sort of letter, pre-printed letter, which has pre-printed remarks about a soldier's health, whether he was leaving the front, whether the addressee's latest letter had arrived. But he was only allowed to strike out whichever lines didn't apply. Nothing could be added, you say. That left no room for remarks such as, "I've been blinded by gas," or "My commanding officer is a sadist." I mean, I know of course I've got to go and get hold of one of these whiz bangs, but it's so that's it, isn't it, Eric? Is that wartime is where this stuff gets super sharp.
It gets sharp to the point where it cuts through literally everything. I mean, that was Lloyd George talking. He was ruminating on exactly what his own government was doing. The British censorship during World War One was pretty much astounding. Uh,
Mm.
there were thousands and thousands of people hired to sort through mail to make sure that the truth didn't come out. There were pictures of the war dead were barred. Also in the United States, there's this enormous. If we talk about touchiness, there's a real sense during wartime of just straight out vulnerability,
Mm.
and the loyalty of the populace is never assured, and the loyalty of the fighting forces is never assured. We always in this country being mine during Vietnam, during our various Iraq adventures, there's this impulse, this compulsion. It's almost like a reflexive reaction by governments to start to suppress news that is truth that doesn't work or that doesn't fit the program. I mean, it's a cliche. Truth is the first casualty of war. Well, truth really is the first casualty of war. America is probably the worst in this regard. And when we go back to what we did to the Japanese by bombing them twice, there's of course an argument whether we needed to, but we did. So then we occupied Japan. The Japanese were, shocked. Uh, we occupied Japan for years afterwards, and during that time, a number of Japanese people were trying to write about what they had experienced.
Right.
And there was a book called, I think it was "The Bells of Nagasaki," written by someone who was there and a survivor, and he wrote graphically about what he had experienced. Well, the American military authorities, suppressed that book for 2 or 3 years, and in fact, why? Because they thought it would make the Japanese um, discontent, as if they needed this book to make them discontent. We firebombed them for years, and we actually flattened two of their major cities, and it was only allowed finally, by the American authorities in Japan, if a chapter was added describing Japanese atrocities in the Philippines. And so this kind of
Mm.
wartime and post-war time and trying to keep your narrative straight is, and for this whiz bang that you're talking about, yes, that absolutely circumscribed what soldiers can report home. and it left no room for truth. It really only was, it was a relentlessly cheerful little thing. It was one of the first forms, these horrible things that we've lived with our whole lives that people have had to fill out.
You say, of course, quoting Orwell, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. Another great or well quote. We're
Yeah.
going to have to whiz through, Eric, and there's so much in the book. I mean, I loved your thing about the fact that the French censors didn't only ban words they considered offensive, but they considered work that they thought was boring or low quality, because that's another whole thing about aesthetic censorship, isn't it? I mean, and you talk about Erich Honecker, the leader of East Berlin. He was a fiddler, he fiddled with other people's works. Stalin, again, another one, it wasn't just the kind of political stuff, but he would sort of watch a film and then sort of make comments to the director about character changes and all sorts of stuff. He couldn't keep his hands off things. Whenever something was in front of him, he had to fiddle with it. But you
Amazing.
talked about there's the whole relationship between freedom of speech and censorship. Talk a little bit about, or just talk about your opinion on that.
I think like everyone else, I take several positions. You know, um, I'm a sentient person, and there are truths and beliefs that I hold dear, and when I hear things or see things that rattle, that challenge that, or that insult that, or that I feel insult my cherished ancestors, I identify very strongly with being Jewish, and when I hear anti-Semitic stuff or Holocaust denial, things like that, it upsets me, and there's an impulse in me to want to stop that. But then the better me realizes that that's not, for all the reasons that we've just described, futile and wrong. And so I think, in a period now where we are very, the people out of power, that is, people, students, professors, participants in the internet are, calling out and, effectively silencing others. Um, I find that to be really, really, really dangerous. I think we're reverting. One of the things about censorship is every time issues come up, people approach them as if they've happened for the first time. And in the UK particularly, and in America particularly, we've lost the appreciation, because we've grown up with it. We've lost the appreciation of just how valuable open dialogue is. I mean, you in the UK are now about to pass a law that puts a duty of care on the internet platforms to bar the larger ones speech that is what's called lawful but awful, speech that might be legal under the law but still might cause someone, quote, psychological harm. Well, the notion of harm is a very, very fluid one. So where do I stand personally? I stand as injured as anyone else by words that hurt me or images that offend me. But I've spent the last 2, 3 years working on a project that tells me that that's the price
Hmm.
that you pay to live in an open society. I don't mind walking around with a rock in my shoe, if it means that I can walk at all.
You mentioned earlier too, in terms of self-censorship, because I'm guilty. It's like we live in
Of
this age of
course.
cancel culture and deplatforming.
Yeah.
As well as all the stuff that you mentioned then. Trying to pass crazy laws about massively subjective things like harm, etc. But I find myself, not saying things, not asking certain questions, or certainly not in a public arena, because do I want to face and get involved in all the stuff that's going to mean? So, and of course, that is, I think, in terms of say George Orwell's vision of the future versus Aldous Huxley's vision of the future in Brave New World. It seems that kind of Huxley won out in a way, didn't it? The Soviet Empire fell, which is Orwell's vision. Whereas Huxley's kind of thing was the soft power, the power of information. And of course, self-censorship is possibly, in a way, the most effective type of censorship, is it not?
Uh, and agreed again, because and it's not just self-censorship. I mean, John Stuart Mill, I talk about, it's, not at great length, but I touch on him, that there's the censorship of the state, but there's also the tyranny of society itself, which he called it the tyranny of the majority, but it's also the tyranny of the loudest characters. I mean, when you're going to lose your position in a university for something that you've written, when
Right.
you're going to lose, when you're going to have your admission revoked because of something that you said maybe 5, 10 years ago, when you're going to lose your job because of something, because what's interesting is, as I said, this notion of harm. What is harm? Is Apple just fired one of their top executives for a book that he had written years ago about the tech revolution, and he made some sexist comments in the book.
Hmm.
Whatever. They weren't hateful. They were just indelicate. Let's put it like that.
Right.
And it immediately, I mean, the book had been out. It had actually been on the bestseller list years ago, and a number of Apple employees, gathered together and signed a petition and said, "We can't exist with this person here in this company." Okay, are they harmed, or is that impulse to get rid of this guy? And Apple did get rid of him.
Right.
Um, it was the book that he wrote was called Chaos Monkeys. Is that act of censorship, that suppression of this person in his job, was less a question of harm as much as it is a statement of an act of faith. I don't believe in sexism. By getting rid of this guy, you're not getting rid of sexism. Okay, what you're
Right.
getting rid of is this person in his job, and so I think where I stand is that we sort of need to stop and recalibrate and do some reflection on what it is to listen to other ideas.
What we're seeing as well is that people rushing forward, either corporations rushing forward and sacking people before their brand gets damaged as they perceive it, or
Yeah.
when somebody gets publicly held up via social media, they're them immediately rushing out and apologizing and going into treatment and all this sort of stuff. It is actually right. It's a little bit like the sort of Soviet show trials, where people are flinging themselves on the floor and telling you how wrong they've been. There's so much grey and nuance in it, in when we are sort of seeking black and white definite angels and demons and stuff. And is there anything that you sort of concluded by doing that survey, History of Censorship through the ages, any kind of commonality or themes that run through it all that you can kind of like finish up with?
Well, I mean, one of the purposes of the book was not only to delve into all these things, but also to tell human stories. And
Mm,
there's nothing more interesting to me. And hopefully the book, which is not written for professors, or it's written for the audience of this show, who are just interested in how humanity conducts itself and how we think. And so, one of the key purposes of the book was just to enlighten, amuse, inform, and caution us that some of the impulses that we're feeling might be, good for the short term, but not quite good for the long term. And so, the marketplace of ideas is a very, very dynamic place. And we're in a situation where we're creating systems where we're getting steered toward the frozen food and candy aisles much more than
right.
the healthy stuff. So, what is Dangerous Ideas? It's yet another collection of fascinating and sometimes disturbing human foibles.
It's a rollicking read, actually, because it's full of human
Thank you.
stories. And actually, of course, before we finish, we should just turn briefly to the subject of images, because that's another big part of it too. You talk about iconoclasm, and of course that runs all the way through from in artwork, in paintings, of course, in films. We have decided to ban certain images. I mean, officially ban them from consumption. There's a difference, isn't there, between the production of images and the broadcast of images or words. So where are you on that, say, when it comes to pornography and the restriction of certain images which have probably caused harm in their creation? Let's put it that way.
There are images that have become poisonous in and of themselves, such as the swastika
Hmm.
or other things. And so we've always had this idea from the beginning that certain images are infested with evil spirits, you know, or certain images have symbolic value that is wrong. As far as the suppression of pornography, unless there's, underage people involved, I'm not really for that because I think it just simply channels it in the wrong sense. It channels, it's more of a class-based censorship. My sense of images is that they can often have a much more immediate and visceral impact than words can because you need a lot less thinking to absorb them.
Right.
But just for that reason, I don't think that suppressing the swastika has any good effect on suppressing Nazism or suppressing white supremacy. There's always a cost to suppression. The ideas don't go away, and when we shove them underneath the rug, they just fester, and often they become forbidden fruit in themselves.
What are you going to do next?
Well, I've got to finish up all these refugee cases that are overwhelming me right now, but the next large writing project, it will something will most likely grow out of this project. There's 2 or 3 ideas that I'm cooking on, or I might just simply move on to write about asylum and refugees and some of the stories that have come out of that. There's a lot that I've learned and seen that hasn't been reported.
Right. Well, listen, Eric, thank you so much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture and
pleasure.
And talking about dangerous ideas and the book. I wanted to sort of leave you with a sort of little gift. I thought you might enjoy this in terms of the overall theme of the book and the fact that, censorship doesn't work and it often has the opposite effect, etc. So this is Maxim Gorky. He's talking about jazz music in 1928 in Pravda, the state organ of news. There are rumblings, wails and howls like the smarting of a metal pig, the shriek of a donkey or the amorous croaking of a monstrous frog. Bestial cries are heard, neighing horses, wild screaming, hissing, rattling, wailing, moaning, cackling. The insulting chaos of insanity pulses to a throbbing rhythm. Listening to this screaming music for a few minutes, one involuntarily imagines an orchestra of sexual maniacs, led by a man-stallion beating time with an enormous phallus. The monstrous bass belches out English words. A wild horn wails piercingly, calling to mind the cries of a raving camel. A drum pounds monotonously. A nasty little pipe tears at one's ears. A saxophone emits its quacking nasal sound. Fleshy hips sway and thousands of heavy feet tread and shuffle. The music of the degenerate ends finally with a deafening thud.
All right, so that makes me want to go out and play some jazz.
Exactly.
Oh, really? Is that what you say about jazz? I think I'm going to go buy some Ellington records right now.
I mean, is there anything more guaranteed to get young people interested in jazz than that?
A man stallion beating time with a phallus? I want to hear that, yeah.
You also can't help thinking, because it's a wonderful piece of writing, actually, you can't help thinking that secretly he was a fan, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, he was paying attention. What a fabulous quote.
That's it. So, listen, Eric, we look forward to the book coming out here, and I do recommend it, actually, as a tremendous... I mean, apart from the fact that it's about a deeply important subject, actually, it is a collection of wonderful, as you said, disturbing, moving, and often quite funny stories. Thanks, Eric.
I appreciate it.
There we have it. You can check out this book, Dangerous Ideas, and Eric's other work at his website, ericberkowitz.com. That's Eric with a C, Berkowitz with a K. And the book is published by Penguin Random House. Random Penguin, I think, as they're calling themselves these days. I don't know about you, but I mean, I felt sort of educated by that conversation, but also relieved, strangely. It kind of brought a bit of light into a very sort of muggy, foggy area for me. And another episode in the Bureau of Lost Culture. You can check out all our episodes at bureauoflostculture.com, and of course now on all the major podcast providers. If you listen to it via Apple, leave us a review, would you? And a 5-star review, of course. And uncensored. And we will see you, hear you, next time for for more Tales from the Other Side. I'm Stephen Coates.